late coming in, and then
Okay, great.
I'll just do a little like introduction for you guys, and then you guys can just take it away from there.
Awesome. That sounds great.
Yeah.
And how are we doing questions? I'd love to see a stream of questions coming in like throughout the talk. If there's a way to get
there's a Q&A tab section. There's a Q&A tab right next to the screen share button, and it's kind of up to you guys. You can either answer questions during the talk, like as they come in, or a lot of times people just wait until the very end and then answer all the questions in one go.
I think it's okay to have them coming throughout the session, actually. And I'd love to make it more interactive in general. So I think it's okay for people to pop questions while we're talking, and we can jump in and make it a little more organic.
Yeah, I like the idea of that.
All right, well, great. We'll just start probably in like another 2 minutes.
Yeah, just to give you guys some context, I do have a small structure in mind on like some really basic points I want to cover about democratization of AI in the sort of broader landscape, and then dig deep into EY. And I think at that point, and Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, I think at that point we want to start taking questions and get more sort of interactivity from the audience, because this is our journey, right? It's not exactly, we haven't reached the destination of democratization of AI across EY. So I think that's going to be super interesting to hear audience feedback at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we can do is you can start typing in questions, and then when we reach the break point, we can then make it right. But like if as we're going through the slides, if a question triggers, then you don't have to wait all the way until the end to type it in. Just type it in the box. I can obviously read them, and then when we reach the natural Q&A point, we can make this more of a conversation. Because the goal is not a lot of slides. In fact, we have very few slides. The goal is really to have that conversation with the group, and the way I like to say it is Vish is here to do the educational bit of it. I'm here to tell the stories, the war stories, and the battle scars I have accumulated over the years. So that we'll play it by ear. So I'm really interested in also hearing about from the group, what they've heard about or what they're doing, and what some of the challenges are that they're having, and maybe we can creatively brainstorm some ideas.
And take a couple of pictures for the gram.
Yeah, it's gone from like, we're now at 34 participants at 5 p.m. on a middle of the week. That's pretty impressive, actually. 35.
I'm telling you, man, it's the hair and the beard. It draws in the crowd.
Why don't we test out the Q&A system? Does anyone want to ask their first question, just so that we break the ice? I would encourage somebody to just throw in a Q&A in the Q&A just to see the system and start populating questions. Again, for folks who are just joining, we want to keep this interactive, so feel free to send your rolling questions in, and as soon as the slides are done, we'll obviously do that. Yes, it is being recorded.
A question.
Yes, it will be. Yes, the answer is.
Let me answer live.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the answer is yes. It will be recorded. That's the first question. I love it. Oh, the questions are coming in already. I love this. This is awesome.
So we're definitely going to talk about that later on. It's a pretty broad ranging question, and we're going to start by defining what democratization means, and we're going to do all of that. So I think these are great questions, and I think we'll get to
keep them coming. Just put them in, and that's great.
Yeah, so we're gonna just go ahead and get started. But before I welcome our two esteemed guests, I'd just like to invite those who have not already done so to please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Magnimind Academy, where we upload recorded sessions of these talks so you can watch them later. You can also comment any questions you have, or just let us know what you think about today's talk in the comment section below. All right, I would also like to welcome Vishnu and Ken Priyadarshi, who will be speaking about democratization and data in AI. At Magnimind, we strive to find speakers who can give different perspectives on data science and AI to kind of go along with our data science education programs. These programs range from focusing on the fundamental skills of data science all the way to assisting an entire career change into the data science industry. But our goal at Magnimind is impacting the careers of as many people as we can, and this is just one way that we do so. Vishnu joins us with 7 years experience building AI products, and his work includes stops with companies such as Mobius Loop and IBM. Educated by University of Toronto and also MIT, he has most recently been heavily involved in artificial intelligence operations with different startups. Ken Priyadarshi is no second fiddle, though, with 13 years of his own experience within the tech industry. Having worked with companies such as Deloitte and IBM as well, he and Hari join us now with EY, where they are heavily involved in the product side of the company, and both are going to be showing us kind of a different way of looking at data science and AI. We at Magnimind are extremely excited to host them, and we'd like to give you now, direct your full attention to Vishnu and Ken.
Thank you so much, Thomas. How's it going, everyone? We have almost 50 attendees now, which is definitely at least 45 more than I expected, so that's awesome. So thank you so much for hosting us, Thomas and April. I know it took a while for us to get everything together on EY's side. We are definitely a company of process, but we're also not too bad at execution. So here comes the execution bit, where we talk about the kind of things we're doing when it comes to democratization of data and AI within EY. But I wanted to start by sort of giving some structure and then going into the more unstructured parts of this little webinar or talk, whatever you want to call it. I think we're going to start out by sort of setting out the landscape of what democratization of AI actually is. I think Thomas did a great job introducing us, so I'll keep the introduction of Ken and myself part to just sort of later on when we get to it in the slide. But broadly speaking, I wanted to start by giving you a landscape of what AI and machine learning looks like today and where we've come, and also get really in detail into what EY is doing in terms of democratizing access to AI, what our vision is, what our roadmap is. Mind you, we haven't really, no one can say they've succeeded at democratizing. It's a path, it's a process. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is things that we would like to do. So at that point, we'd like to have an open discussion with you guys on your understanding of democratization of AI. So I think if I had to make a couple of assumptions, I would assume that most of this audience are data scientists with a decent amount of technical expertise. Would I be accurate in making that assumption, Thomas and April? I'm going to assume that's a yes.
Yeah, sorry. Pretty much, yeah, most people have at least some sort of background in AI or data science.
Great. So I'm not going to go into sort of your classical definitions of what AI and machine learning is. I think that would be maybe not the best fit for this current audience. So I'm just going to get right into the meat of things. So I have a couple of slides from EY approved slides, and there's a sort of small agenda. Maybe we can actually start by doing our own sort of introductions. I think Thomas did a great job, but what I'd add to the background is I think it's always valuable for data scientists to understand, how other data scientists got into the field. I actually wouldn't consider myself a data scientist. I consider myself more of like a product and machine learning focused engineer. I fell into data science during my undergraduate research work in astrophysics at the University of Toronto. University of Toronto in the mid sort of 2010s was a hotbed for machine learning and AI research. You guys might have heard of the Hinton Group. It was hugely impactful when it comes to AI and machine learning in the current landscape. So anyway, that's sort of my background. Worked a little bit at IBM Watson, at Accenture, co-founded a startup, and now I'm at EY. So Ken, I'd like you to give yourself a quick intro as well.
Sure. So hi, everybody. Ken Priyadarshi. I'm the Global Chief Architect at EY. I work in a group called Client Technology. I'm almost at my 2-year mark at EY, where we're going through a massive transformation related to technology, AI, data, building engineering products, et cetera, which is quite remarkable for a services giant. Prior to my life at EY, I'm I've been working actually for 20 years in our field in a variety of different settings. So a combination of services work at service firms such as Deloitte, KPMG, Bearing Point, Accenture, and then also in more product-centric companies. So if you're on the Wall Street era, there used to be a product company called SunGard that used to build financial products. I worked at IBM myself, and then I also spent time at a startup in the Bay Area related to machine learning. So it's great to be here and great to meet you all.
Cool, thank you for that introduction. So I want to start out by talking about what democratization of AI actually means, right? Like, how exactly do you define something like democratization of AI? If you just Google the term, you'll find people with 10 to 15 different definitions of what democratizing AI means. So I'll give you sort of my interpretation of it, and then Ken, maybe you can chime in and give the audience your definition of democratization of AI. To me, in the current context where I am at EY, democratization of AI means exposing tools and functionality for building and iterating on and deploying machine learning models to folks of varying levels of technical capability. So if you want to break that down, when it comes to technical capability, you have multiple different personas of people who are affected by machine learning and AI. And if you slice it all up, democratization means that they can actually build something and add value using AI, regardless of what their technical background is. And to me, that's what it means. Ken, do you want to give sort of your thoughts on what democratization of AI means?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I try to sort of answer democratization of data from multiple angles, both from starting with a talent and culture angle to sort of a data structures or how do we sort of like open up systems angle? So I guess a systems thinking way. And then the third piece is actually from a data product perspective. So to me, whenever people ask me, well, how are we going to democratize data? I usually say, well, let's start by looking at a multidimensional answer in all three different dimensions. And can we actually move the needle in those three dimensions? And if we move the needle forward, then we've started moving towards what I would call sort of a higher democracy index score for data or AI at that particular company, right? So that's how I've typically thought about it.
Awesome. I like to use a specific analogy that I think the first person to use the analogy was probably Andrew Ng, who's, if you don't know Andrew Ng, he's a pretty famous professor at Stanford who hosted a lecture series that I think a lot of data scientists have seen in terms of introduction to AI and machine learning. He spoke about AI as the new electricity. And I wanted to just give some context by digging in on what that exactly means. And for the audience, I'd like to have you think back to sort of the early 1900s, late 1800s, right? If you really think back to what electricity meant to people then, it was magic, right? You needed to have an army of specialists in situ inside of your homes to even be able to derive any kind of real value from electricity. There's a lot of misconceptions and fears about what electricity could mean. There's a whole host of weird experiments that were undertaken, like shocking an elephant using a DC current. I think those kind of stories you hear about how there was a lot of danger in electricity. But today, what it's become is it's a utility, right? You expect it in your life, and you derive an immense amount of value from using it as a utility, whether it's from cooking food or to powering your laptops and desktops. I can't imagine, and I don't think you can imagine a life without access to electricity. I think right now we're in that sort of 1850 stage in terms of years when it comes to AI and machine learning. There's a lot of misinformation around what it can and cannot do. There's a lot of misunderstandings about the applications of AI, and there's a lot of doubt about where AI is actually going to evolve into, right? I think the classical image of AI and machine learning in popular media is your Skynet. It's your AGI that's intent on taking over the world, or you have something like that Joaquin Phoenix movie, Her, right, where you have an AI that someone can fall in love with. As a practitioner, as someone who enjoys entertainment, I love it. It's awesome. It's great. I did get to tell people making AI, they think of those things, right? It's fun. But as a practitioner, I think it's far from the truth. We're, in my opinion, nowhere near that. But the the flip side is also true. We're already deriving a huge and immense amount of value from machine learning and AI. So I don't agree with the other side of things that says AI is all just hype, right? And I wanted to giving that context, I wanted to sort of build a couple of attributes out on what machine learning and AI needs to become, or the kind of attributes they need to have to be truly useful. And these aren't my attributes, by the way. These are collected from research papers, YouTube videos, talks I've attended. And this is sort of like the list. And I'll go through that, and that'll sort of give you maybe some idea of what useful machine learning and AI is. And these are the features. Good AI needs to be portable, explainable, credible, fair, decentralized and distributable, declarative, reproducible, scalable, auditable, actionable, governable, and discoverable. And that's a whole lot of things, right? I think that's sort of broadly speaking across all industries. This is what AI needs to be. For specific industries, maybe you only need to focus on having good governance and audit. For other industries, you don't need to care so much about scalability. You'll need to care about trust, for example. So it really depends on the application you're looking for when it comes to AI and machine learning. And if I had to sort of dig into each of these points, I can explain it just at a very surface level. Portability is essentially if you write code once, you should be able to run it wherever you want, right? So it's separating the creation of AI from the consumption of AI. Explainability is really obvious. I think that's something everyone's really concerned about. If a model outputs a prediction, can we really query what it means by the prediction and how it arrived at that conclusion? And I'd club in explainability with auditability and governability. They're kind of in that same bucket. Credibility is more, in my opinion, to do with the data that's used to inform a machine learning model than the actual process of coming to a conclusion. Is the data that you use to train a model actually credible? Does it have inherent biases? I noticed that one of the first questions that we had is, how do you remove bias from AI? And I think the most obvious answer is that you actually start with the data. And I'd say, in addition to that, you start with a human collecting the data. I think machine learning models that have bias in them are more reflective of the human biases we've had when we're actually building data sets that are used to train these machine learning models. And there are many papers, interesting papers you can read about that quantify that. The next thing is fair. I think that comes into the same point. Yeah, Ken, go ahead.
A question just came in. Are we on the right presentation slide? Are you moving it, or are you?
No, I'm on this slide, because the next few slides are actually going to be about EY. I'm just going to give a landscape thing first, and then we're going to dig into what EY does later. Okay. So what's the question?
No, I think the question was literally like, are we on the right presentation slide, or are we still on the intro slide?
No, we're still on. I didn't do any slides for the general thing, because I think it would have taken forever to get through our internal process. So I cheated a little. Okay. So decentralized and distributable. This is something we focus a lot at EY, and we're going to dig into that when we talk about how EY thinks about democratization of AI. But the idea is to let models go where the data is, rather than the other way around. You're not always chasing the data, right? So that's one thing. Declarative is being able to document exactly what the model is intending to do, regardless of what the output of the model actually is. So it's more of an engineering thing to actually debug your model, to figure out what went wrong. Reproducible, any good scientific experiment is reproducible, and there's no reason why machine learning models shouldn't be as well. And that's sort of like the main points, right? At EY, we care a lot about trust and fairness, auditability of our models, deploying models at scale. And I think this is sort of the segue into what we do at EY. So I'm actually going to use my slides that are approved for public consumption. So before we really get into democratization of AI at EY, we're going to look into infusion. So before you can democratize access to AI, we have to think about, how does EY as a business infuse machine learning and AI into every product we build, or our main service lines? And I'm going to give the folks here some context on what EY actually is. And Ken, I might need you to jump in here, because you're more experienced at EY than I do. So I might get some things wrong. So EY has 4 to 5 really key service lines. It's got audit. Audit is, I think that's pretty obvious. I'm not going to get into it unless you want me to. Accounting, also really obvious. Tax, which is, how do companies get taxed, and how do they reduce or change their tax burden, or manage all the complexities of tax when they do international business. And advisory, which is kind of our consulting, classic Deloitte, Accenture style consulting practice. And I guess TAS, I don't know if TAS is exactly part of that service line metric, but those are the sort of 5 service lines. I've only been here for a year, so apologies if I get some of them wrong. Now, what we look at the AI organization, so to give some context, I work in the AI organization at EY. We try to understand what impact we can have for the partners and the staff that work in each one of these verticals, and what is the sort of definable, quantifiable metric we're looking to move when we build or we decide to engage to build AI models. So that first step becomes defining a business outcome. I think that's important for any product, for any sort of machine learning model you build. It needs to be doing something that is deriving value to the business. And we'll dig deep into what some of those metrics actually mean, but that's the first step. The second is technical feasibility. You know, one of my favorite phrases when I was at Accenture actually doing consulting was, most of the time you don't need machine learning and AI. You don't need a deep learning model because you could possibly just use a friggin' regression curve. And the number one thing that I think most data scientists and machine learning consultants will find themselves doing is actually saying no. And I would advise most of the data scientists on this call to be brave and to see, you know, try not to cave into the temptation to shove AI and machine learning into everything. Use your intuition. You know, the technical feasibility of any kind of project is probably the biggest indicator of whether it's going to be successful. And you don't want to find yourself implementing a deep learning model when regression curve would have done the job just fine, right? So scoping technical feasibility, that's the second step. The third is we think about risk and governance, right? What is the risk to our business if we get things wrong? And if we do decide to build this model, how do we deploy it? How do we govern it as it's actually generating predictions? And what is the quality of the data that we're using to actually train this model? Super important because we're in the business of risk. EY, it's not an engineering company. We're a big four consulting, accounting, tax, advisory. We need to make sure that if we do build models that affect our clients or even our internal EY clients, they need to be performing well, and they need to have had data that is clean, that has been you know, verified to be free of bias. Next is compliance. There are a lot of international laws to think about. A good example at EY is there are some countries that have red box rules where basically data cannot leave the geographic confines of you know, that specific country. I mean, I'm from Canada. I work in San Francisco, but I'm from Canada, but I cannot actually use Canadian data from Canadian clients to train a model if I'm building it in SF. It's strange and weird, but that's how it works. You can't have data portability is a huge issue, right? So you need to be aware of that. And whenever you think about scaling AI, you have to think about that as well. And finally, repeatable assets. This is actually, I'd say, our main focus right now for Ken and myself at EY is to make sure that if a team has built an AI product, a second team is not duplicating that effort and doing the same things over and over again. You'd see this a lot. You see tech companies, the FANG companies doing this pretty well, actually, making their frameworks and libraries easily accessible and open source for everybody to use. It's an awesome movement, and at EY, we're trying to learn from that. So that covers sort of my view on how EY is working in when it comes to infusing AI into our main products. I want to pause here for a second. Ken, what are your thoughts on this? What do you want to add to this? You know, what's your thoughts?
I think, you know, one of the reasons I again left pure engineering and joined EY is because it's actually a really interesting target-rich environment for things like document intelligence and natural language processing and text analytics, and specifically, you know, so Bill Gates has a great interview on Bloomberg where he talks about how he thinks that the next 2-3 decades, he thinks that the biggest thing that we could do is just teach a computer how to better read papers and documents and make sense of them, right? So, you know, I think building semantic NLP pipelines and things of that nature are huge opportunities in large services firms like EY. And I think what we are trying really hard to do is to say, okay, if we look at our big businesses, you know, audit, tax, et cetera, how do we, in the products, the actual digital products that we're building in these business services, how do we, in these digital products, infuse intelligence that helps us read a document in an automated or semi-automated way, or helps us predict a risk as opposed to someone doing a checklist manually, right? So it's actually a really amazing time to be in services. You know, in the 20 years that I have been in services, we're seeing more interesting digital work happening now than ever before. So, you know, I'll again do a little plug for EY here is, you know, we're actually one of the few firms that has its own built-in dedicated client product engineering teams, and that's a transformation that's happening in the firm as we speak, where we've said we need to go build digital products and make them available to our clients that do that essentially help us accelerate and augment our services, but then also brings in and embed AI into our services, whether it's finding tax benefits to finding risks in an audit cycle, right? So the ability to look at business problems in our classic lines of business, like consulting, risk management, et cetera, and then being able to find AI technologies or data accelerators that help us make that journey easier is you know, is a lot of fun. You know, that's how I would think about it.
So I got a quick question here from Prasad. Do you work closely with the EY Global AI Innovation Lab in Palo Alto? Yes, I do. So basically my role, I actually didn't spend a lot of time talking about it. I just realized that, sorry. This virtual stuff is a little dissociative. So yes, I have a dual reporting structure. So I work both in our group in EY called Client Technology, which focuses on building technology assets and products for our clients, both internal and external to EY. And I also work with the AI leader, Nigel Duffy and Hans Jessen, who run the Global Innovation Labs. Our mandate, or I'd say my mandate and my engineering team's mandate, is to essentially take the products built in AI labs and scale them across EY. So hope that answers your question. Cool. All right. So moving on. Oops. Okay. So great perspective, Ken. I think we've given a pretty good picture of how EY thinks about technology, of the kind of opportunities that exist in these kind of service companies. We've spoken a little bit about AI democratization, or the field of AI democratization and what it means. And we've spoken a little about AI infusion, how EY thinks about building AI into products. Now, I really like the question that Prasad gave because it kind of segues into this point, right? The current structure by which products are built, or AI products are built at EY today, is you have an incredibly awesome research group in Palo Alto that builds products like document intelligence. And you have our AI engineering team, which is brand new. We just started about a year ago, that take these products and scale them for our clients globally, right? That's how we currently think about AI at EY. But what is the next step? We're doing that pretty well. It's been very successful. The next step, I think, is to think about democratization of AI. And when I think about democratization of AI in the context of what we do at EY, I know it's really confusing. AI and EY, they rhyme and they always throw me off too. But when I think about it in that context, I think about what Excel meant for the audit industry, or honestly, any industry that deals with spreadsheets in the 90s, right? Excel and macros, and I'd say macros more so than Excel. Firstly, Excel sort of revolutionized the way accounting and tax and all these other fields were done. And secondly, I think it was the last big revolution, frankly, in these fields. I think AI is the next big one. Macros made it easy for, I don't know if there are any big four folks here, but macros are pretty much an everyday existence for anybody that deals with Excel spreadsheets. Macros made it super easy for people to do very simple rudimentary programs, or write very simple, I'd say low code, to make their Excel spreadsheets do certain things, okay? I think that seeing the success of macros, I think machine learning and AI can be that next major disruptive force within the service lines that EY operates in. So what does that look like? And I frankly don't think there is an answer. The goal of this is not to really give an answer, but to have an open discussion for what democratization of AI can look like. So to move on to the next slide, I think to start thinking about it, we have to sort of break it down. We have to think about the different personas. We have to think about how they actually do their job today. We have to think about how machine learning would actually integrate into their current workflows. We have to think about how they'd actually show the work that they've done in building these models to their partner or to their client. And we have to make sure their partner is comfortable with whatever they've built. So let's dig into each of these points a little bit. The personas, data scientist, auditor, is very, very different right? When it comes from a technical perspective, someone who's pretty technically proficient, like a data scientist, is comfortable working with libraries and frameworks, is comfortable writing code. Maybe they're not at the level of a machine learning engineer where they necessarily can build an entire data pipeline, right? But they're comfortable building models. They understand what statistics means. They understand how to test their models. But a auditor or tax professional might not necessarily come to the table with those skills. They might develop it later on, but they're going to start out, thinking, I have a certain business outcome I want to drive. How do I do that with machine learning and AI? The current system in which we solve this is a data scientist and a machine learning engineer works with an auditor or tax professional to build them the solution, that AI solution that's actually going to move some measurable business metric for them, right? It could be reading documents easier. It could be looking at an audit opinion and understanding the quality of whether the audit opinion is good or is missing certain elements, right? It could be saving a number of hours an auditor spends actually looking through a company's financial statements. It could be finding financial anomalies, right? That it's a really time-consuming process. But eventually, democratization means that the data scientist focuses on even more high-value problems, like actually maintaining the machine learning model that, let's say, finds fraud in financial accounts, whereas the auditor or tax professional is now able to, in a low-code environment, take those models and apply it to a completely different use case in a different client without having to write a lot of code. They would only go to the data scientist when the model needs some sort of major improvement or needs to be retrained in some certain way. But the basic functions of actually training the model, of deploying it, should be able to be done with a couple of button clicks. And the landscape today, there are actually a couple of companies that do this, and I'll get into that later in the talk, but that's the goal. Going into that, how do you integrate machine learning into the workflow of a staff or an auditor? How do you make it easy for them to understand how machine learning is going to impact their workflow, which is going to change significantly? That question we don't really have an answer to yet, because we're still in the process of actually thinking about this. So I think this is kind of an open question, right? Like, what does it actually mean? We're still working on that. Rapid app prototyping and governance, trust, and transparency. I could talk a little bit about that. And maybe Ken, you can talk a bit about the other rapid app prototyping. Governance, trust, and transparency, I think it's super clear, as I mentioned earlier. When you deploy an AI model for a client, when it comes to their financial accounts, it needs to be trustable, it needs to be explainable, and it needs to be transparent. And that's a given. And how do we do that, right? How do we expose that information to a partner so that they can trust that their staff is not going around doing crazy things with deep learning, machine learning, right? So that's super important for democratization to happen. Ken, do you want to talk a little bit about what app prototyping and low-code model building means for AI?
Yeah, absolutely. And for the folks that are sort of following me virtually, I've been like frantically answering questions, by the way. And I'm looking forward to actually having a live conversation about those questions as we finish the slide soon. But I think to answer Vish's question around, how does app prototyping help us in democratizing AI and data? Well, think about it this way, right? I mean, I think that one of the biggest issues we have right now in large Fortune 100 enterprises is simply organizing and getting the data together, very often from multiple silos, to answer a data question or write a predictive model or do some kind of risk analysis. And so if you have the mindset of rapid app prototyping, you are forced to think in agile ways also for building your machine learning model or your predictive model. And this is somewhat, crazy to think about, but I'm actually a big believer in actually building models iteratively. You get a what you think is a cohesive or comprehensive data set, and you train on it, and you start looking at it around that. Like, hey, this seems a little biased if I look anywhere outside my business unit, but the app works great for at least my immediate campaign or business unit and solves a major problem for risk management mitigation. But chances are I can't apply that to another country, another sector, things like that. But nevertheless, I still believe that if we bring the principles of rapid app prototyping into the world of data applications or data product, the ability, it acts almost as a forcing function to push us to deploy the models out there, right? I mean, there are so many models out there sitting on the laptops of talented people all over Silicon Valley that never get into production, right? And I'm a big believer that look, if it's not actually in production and making a prediction and helping us inform a decision or recommending something to us, even if it's just in a prototype, it's not real. I never really democratized it, right? So I'm a big believer that I think prototyping is actually a great forcing function to democratize AI and data. Hope that answers it. Vish, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, I just realized I'm muted. Yeah, it's a great point, Ken. And I think I was actually just looking at the questions that you answered, and there's some incredible questions there. Especially the one that was on why do we need to democratize AI? And I think we're gonna actually talk a little bit about that in the Q&A sessions. I think that's a very important question. The best question obviously was, do you need long locks and a beard to work for the EY tech team? When I joined, I had hair length up till here, but I don't think it's a necessity. No. So thanks for the questions. Keep them coming. So let's go on to the next thing. I think we've spoken about what the path would be if we wanted to democratize AI DY, right? We're really talking fantasy terms here because we've just now figured out how to infuse AI, and we're now charting the path of what democratization means. And I think it's super exciting because it could be anything, right? And that's part of why Ken and I were so excited to do this, is because this is an open forum. Your ideas are probably as relevant, even more so insightful than ours. So great questions, keep them coming, great thoughts. I wanted to get into what the impact would be. And I think that might kind of answer the question a little on why we should democratize AI at EY or at any other company. So I think the first thing is to understand how the Big Four plays when vis-a-vis a FANG or an engineering organization. It's a completely different mindset, and this is coming from the background of an ML, and I wouldn't really say I'm a great engineer, but I'm kind of an engineer. But even when I talk to the people that I've hired who are actual engineers on my team, the mindset when it comes to building products at UI or any Big Four or even any consulting organization is very different than an engineering company, right? And I think I don't want to be generalizing because every company is different, every situation is different. But in a FANG or a service integrator like Accenture, you have a very clear idea of what you're trying to drive, right? Like you're building a machine learning model to detect similarity in images uploaded to Facebook because you want to take down fake news, for example. With Netflix, you're building machine learning models to figure out if someone's going to like a movie. In a service integrator like Accenture, you're building models for a client, and the client tells you exactly what they want. When it comes to Big Four, our problems are, I think, a little bit more nebulous. They're a little bit harder to define. Audit is an over 200, maybe 1,000-year practice, right? It's the same thing. You're looking at a company's accounts and saying, does everything match up? Does the left side match the right side, right? What is the value that machine learning and AI is going to provide? What is the value an engineering team is going to provide? What is the value technology is going to provide? That's like the first sort of questions you have to be able to answer to the partners. And at the end of the day, you're still beholden to the partners themselves, right? They've got clients, they do audits, they do accounting, they do tax advisory, whatever it is. They need to be able to convince their client that having machine learning in this process is going to make it faster, cheaper, more accurate, or some other measure like that. And when it comes back down to the engineering team, you're working with these sort of relatively nebulous set of requirements. And what does it really mean to make an audit faster? What does it mean to make an audit have higher quality, right? Now, putting those challenges in one side, an extremely important part of thinking about AI at companies like EY or even KPMG is that our reputation as someone who provides services for the biggest companies in the world is the number one thing. And AI is an incredibly risky space. The impact of a machine learning model identifying a dog as a cat is minuscule, right? There could be some terrible impact that could happen for machine learning models that that have been talked about in the media as identifying criminals and that kind of stuff. But those risks are very clear and they can be rectified. But if an audit goes wrong because an ML model had the wrong output or identified a certain transaction as risky when it really wasn't, that's a hit to EY's reputation. And you have to understand how you could sort of build safeguards against that. And that is something that an engineering team needs to be able to convince a partner and we need our own processes in place to make sure that we de-risk an inherently risky process. And when you think about democratization, which is giving tools to everybody at EY, your risk then multiplies exponentially, right? It's not just now an engineering team building AI models, it's every staff member of EY of 400,000 people, right? So we have to think about how we manage that. And that's a huge challenge. I don't think it's a problem that we solve at all. And I think that the clues there are to start with the data, but we don't know. The other part, which is a huge, I'd say personal issue for me, which I've been learning to deal with in the past year I've been at EY, is I think with my background, I have kind of an innovation mindset. And an innovation mindset means you prototype fast, you move fast, you fail fast, right? You can't really fail fast at EY. I mean, you can with certain safeguards, but it's not exactly in the culture of EY to do that. And you deal with a lot of processes, and that does tend to slow down innovation. So the question then becomes, how do you maintain the balancing act, right? Some of these processes are so important to EY's existence and maintaining its reputation. So how do you keep those processes, but decide some other processes maybe we can do without, right? It's kind of a pull and push. It's tug of war. So that's interesting to navigate. And obviously, there's no one size fits all approach, right? That's the final point I'd like to make. Like, again, when we spoke about the different personas, different people with different technical capabilities approach machine learning and AI in a completely different way, depending on the use case. And that's a lot of features to engineer for. So that's a huge challenge when it comes to democratization as well. You're no longer talking about a computer vision engineer versus a natural language engineer. You're talking about an auditor's use case in machine learning versus a consultant's use case in machine learning. Very different spaces. I'm going to pause on the challenges part to see if Ken, if there's anything you want to add to that as well.
There was actually a great question that I was just typing an answer to, which was, how do you even, this is a great philosophical question. I love it from Gina. How do you even get your clients to believe and understand in the value of any of this in data and AI model? Why even do this? And then as you're doing this, we live very often in very fragile data landscapes and large clients. So how do we sort of like manage that, right? So I'm a big believer that there is a huge talent and cultural change management issue that needs to be addressed around AI and data management, right? How do you, and I've sort of tried to sort of tackle this in two ways. One is we've got to get comfortable when we're working with our clients or in any large enterprise with the notion of doing field experiments based on data and what the model predicts or recommends. I think that field experiment does more than any sales pitch or any recommendation deck in PowerPoint will ever do. And that, I think, changes human behavior and minds than anything else does, right? If you show an A/B test based on, a prediction that is more intelligently recommended based on data versus, gee, we've always done it this way as the baseline, and you can show a return on investment, that's gold, and that's really hard to do. But when that happens, that is what really drives change in a large corporation. And the challenge is, so many data landscapes are fragile in large corporations, particularly the Fortune 500s. How do you do that consistently? I think this is actually a great change management problem, right? I think there's a human side to democratizing data and AI, and we need to, I think, create a new generation of change managers that are very data savvy and can sort of manage the human impact or the process impact of the fact that we have algorithms and experiments recommending changes to the way they do their job, right? So, if that isn't a philosophical problem, then I don't know what is, right? Who would have thought that we would live in an era where, how you conduct your day-to-day job as a food delivery person is driven by an algorithm, not a boss, right? So imagine the impact of that in large corporations, the way you're doing an audit, the way you're doing a recommendation around a text analysis scenario is now suddenly informed by an algorithm, right? How is that going to change the mindset of the person who does their job there, right? That's, to me, these are truly like extraordinary change management, human psychology questions that people with PhDs in organizational behavior change are going to have to address, right? So I think that there's a, executive summary bullet for me, as an addition to this, is there's probably a very interesting change management human equation to actually making any of this even possible. And unless you get past that philosophically, everything else, falls apart.
That's a great point, Ken. This is a really interesting question that came up. I think we should also look into as well. I'm just going to read it out. Operating within large consulting firms like EY, would you ever get to do retail level AI and ML? So how would democratization really work unless driven by small and medium product and service companies? So wanted to understand, I'm going to assume what retail level AI and ML means. You can feel free to put in the chat what you actually mean by retail. My assumption is sort of, man. Okay,
I think
go ahead.
This could, so I think the answer to that, by the way, is possibly yes, by the way. So an example might be, so we do taxes, tax preparation for very large corporations. Would someone like EY ever have a tax chatbot to help you with your taxes? And the answer is possibly yes, actually. And this is an example of where we're doing retail consumer level AI ML recommendation systems, right? Most of our AI and data efforts right now are around our own large clients and large, really, Fortune 100 client engagements. But we have been talking about the possibility of doing more for a consumer level work. And I think there is, I believe, an EY tax chatbot already out there, I think. And I think you're seeing more and more interesting work happening in that space. I think another good example of that is H&R Block and IBM did a really interesting system that was, again, at a consumer level with H&R Block as the channel with IBM technologies for AI and whatnot. So I think we're going to see more increased consumerization of some of the work that we're getting into, and tax might be one of the first places where that happens.
Yeah, great question. I also want to add something. I think the most important thing when it comes to machine learning and AI is to first eat your own dog food before you bring it out to clients. And I mean, we're relatively new in this process, right, of doing machine learning and AI at EY. And most of the work that we do in AI engineering is for internal clients, which are partners that then go, like an audit or accounting, that then, have a specific deliverable for, another external client. I think if we're able to really nail down building AI products internally and making them successful and impactful, the retail equation becomes a lot easier. And that's just sort of my opinion on things. And I think that's, I think there's a lot of little projects around EY where we try to do it at the retail level, but that's my opinion, that's my view. So yeah, moving on. So what is the vision for AI at EY democratized look like? The first is ML model development as accessible as writing macros. Second is an access to a catalog of pre-trained models that are kind of custom built for the most, like 80–90% of situations that most EY staff would face. And segmenting out ML ops versus auto ML versus low code model building. I'll explain what that means. First is, I want to address the first point. I think we would know we're successful when people are able to build models. And I actually think, before I talk about that, I think the first sort of step to think about this question is to think about it from the perspective of user experience. I think only recently have I started seeing an emphasis on UX as a driver of adoption of low-code model building in AI. I think the most recent one is Cortex. I don't know if you guys have heard of Cortex. Super interesting, Google it. They kind of have a GUI interface for actually building models. Another one is Data Robot. But it's still a very nascent field, right? What is the human element, the human user interface element of building models? What does that look like for someone who doesn't know how to write code? I don't think that problem is necessarily solved yet. And it's not as simple as like, a Power Apps or, string code together if-then statements. I don't think it's as simple as that. So it's still an open question, but the goal here is to make it as simple as writing a macro. And writing a macro, by the way, is not simple. When I say simple, I mean accessible, where people can actually start to do it if they learn it. They don't need to understand how to write Python code. So that's one thing. Second is an access to the catalog of pre-trained models. Super important. I mean, I learned machine learning development on scikit-learn. There are a ton of frameworks that help me figure out how all this worked. I mean, I'm a scientist by training, not a computer scientist, right? So that made it a lot easier for me to get my hands dirty with machine learning model building. I think becomes more so important to have a set of pre-trained models that would be excellent for, let's say, 60 to 70% of audit use cases. Say, identifying risky transactions in a general ledger. It's a very simple case. I'm pretty sure you could build a pre-trained model that a novice could work with, right? So that's, I think, is super important to have a library of them. It's how a lot of these tech companies actually do internal model building and development these days. Like most of the models built at the business level aren't necessarily written by data scientists anymore. You think of Uber or even YouTube and Facebook. So yeah, that's one thing. The third point, there's a difference between machine learning ops and democratizing access to ML. And I think a lot of people kind of tend to confuse the two. Machine learning ops is making it easy for an ML team to build, test, train, deploy, and govern models. That's model management, right? And that's or ML ops, as people call it. That empowers your hardcore data scientists and ML engineers to be more effective and impactful. So when they build a model, or they will build a pre-trained model, they're able to assess its impact and figure out and do feature engineering at a much easier way. That's different from democratization of AI. You want to segment the two, right? You want to say, okay, this is what we're doing to make, for the data scientist or ML engineer persona, their lives easy so they can build more models. And then auto ML is what we'll do to make it easy for them to do feature engineering at scale, whatever, right? Then it comes to low code model building, which is taking pre-trained models or pre-existing frameworks and just kind of putting it together into some use case that a non-technical person can prove value with. So those three things are super important to understand and segment and build solutions for. So if you had to ask, where are we within all these three? We're not even at the starting gun, right? I think we have some of these pieces together. We're planning some of these things out at EY, but we're just starting our journey. And it's super exciting because we get to figure out and we get to evolve with the industry. So that's where we are. Ken, would you like to add some stuff to this point as well?
No, I'm good. How much more before we go into the Q&A, or is this where we're sort of ending it?
I think this is where we're at the Q&A. This is sort of our final slide.
Okay, so I mean, we can end it if you want to go back. I think, do you want to flip back to the last slide one more time?
Yeah.
Yes, and I think this sort of relates to a question that came in to say, how is this going to, could you give a very specific example around democratization at a user, like a data scientist user level? And this sort of relates to the access to a catalog of pre-trained models bullet point. But like one of the things we talked about is, this is maybe a 70s or 80s technology construct, but expert systems, right? I mean, one of the big ideas around that is, can we basically spread the expertise of, say, a few really senior tax leaders into a recommender system that could then float into every tax consultant in the firm, right? That might be an example of where we're essentially taken everything from the data to the predictor to the recommender and actually created a reusable expert system that we can use to spread expertise around a particular regulatory environment or geocentric tax benefits realization system, right? So that's a very specific example, but the construct or the idea still counts. You want to go to the next slide? Before we go into Q&A, I do want to say one thing, and one of the reasons. Sorry, the last slide, the one after this, the final one. Yeah. So this is one of the personal reason I joined this call, by the way. For folks who would like to join us in our mission at EY, you should send me a LinkedIn invite or an email address or Vish, and we'd love to sort of, we're building a database always of practitioners who are interested in solving enterprise problems using data and AI. So, feel free to network with us and reach out to us. We're very accessible, and we're happy to sort of guide you to what EY's hiring plans are for FY21. We have so many awesome Q&A questions, and I'm just furiously typing through them. What I thought we could do, Vish, is why don't we just start going through them and just make it conversational at this point. And for folks, as we're going through the answers and the questions, why don't we also keep typing more questions, right? We'll do these as much as I can. It almost I feel like I've been at a Reddit, quite frankly, and doing an AMA, quite frankly. So I really enjoyed that part of this. That was unexpected, but we can probably start answering in chronological order. We could start with the beginning about talk about vertical use cases. Let's talk about a few maybe vertical use cases, right? So, and feel free to jump in, Vish, right? Like at a very high level, audit, no doubt, again, our audit business is all about anomaly detection, risk analysis, tax. We just talked about sort of a benefit recommendation system. Consulting, we're doing a lot of, how do we sort of increase resiliency in a supply chain in this era of COVID? Strategy M&A, the big one these days is, how do we use AI to explore the acquisition ecosystem? Vish, do you want to add more? Like, we can't name clients, but happy. Why don't you add a few more?
Yeah. So the ones that Ken you mentioned, they're great. They're actually a lot more sort of external client focused. I'll talk a little bit about internal clients, right? Like when it comes to our AI team internally, we want to make our staff more effective at their jobs, right? So a good example is an audit. As an auditor, you have to read through a ton of documentation. You need to, to sift through tons of general ledger accounting information, Excel slides, all of that. With machine learning, you can help them find exactly what they're looking for. You can train a model to understand what a good audit opinion actually reads like, right? And it can highlight, hey, for a junior auditor who just joined the firm, hey, you missed these points, right? That's a good example of an internal use case. When it comes to tax, I had a couple of use cases in mind internally, but it's more around, and I'm not a tax person, so I might be getting the details on this completely wrong. But there are some use cases around tax liability across geographies for multinational companies and making it easy for the tax individual to understand, based on certain factors they'd enter into this machine learning model, what could be potential areas of concerns for their client, right? So not necessarily client facing, but definitely making it easier for our folks to do their jobs. Another one is just document search and document intelligence, as we call it, helping our staff learn, interpret, and understand documents using AI and machine learning. So graph search across documents and named entity recognition, looking at the ton of invoices that exist for any client of EY and correlating that with what actually happens in the general ledger or whatever other ledger they use for invoices. I might be wrong, but you have invoices and they need to make sure that it ticks and ties, right? That's another example. There's a ton of these. Honestly, the challenge in terms of vertical use cases is prioritization. What's the most important to the firm? What's the most impactful? And what can we do with the least amount of engineering effort? So low-hanging fruit. That's how we start to think about this. But yeah.
Okay, great. There's another one that just came in. This is really good. I like this one. So it says, Natasha says, I'm in the design space trying to understand AI and data better. How could we reduce misinterpretation or mismanagement of data? You want to go on that first?
Yeah, hi, Natasha. We go way back, so thanks for joining. What's up? So Natasha is a UX designer, so I think this question makes a lot of sense. So firstly, misinterpretation and mismanagement of data. I'm not going to answer that from a UX angle, so I'm just going to talk about the problems with data as it is. So I think the favorite phrase of a data scientist giving a presentation to anybody is garbage in, garbage out. Heard it a billion times, but it still remains to be true. If the models you're using to train your, if the data you're using to train your models is incomplete, inaccurate, riddled with bias and errors, you can't do anything with it. So I guess this is where I think there's a great meld of human and machine. There are a lot of efforts that technical and non-technical to understand the quality of any given data set that is used to train a model. That's one thing you could do to avoid the misinterpretation, is to really understand the source of the data provenance, whether if it's time series data, if there are any missing links in the data. There's a lot of like little things you can zone in on, but broadly speaking, these are the factors you can talk about when it comes to misinterpretation. When it comes to mismanagement, what I assume you mean by that is how like, okay, I'm thinking in the context of like the European laws around people's privacy and sorry, I'm blanking on the name. What's it called, Ken?
Which one? Sorry, say that again.
The European data privacy laws. Why am I suddenly forgetting this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a data sovereignty law. Let's just go with it.
Yeah, whatever. The big one that everyone's concerned about. So when it comes to that, like people, I think what you mean by mismanagement is like, are people using data in a way that's compliant with laws? That's a process answer, right? I think my guess is that it's pretty limited what we can do outside of process to be sure that the data we use to train models are data that is sufficiently anonymized, sufficiently encrypted at some level, doesn't have any personal identifiers involved in it. So that is kind of like a process thing, I'd say.
Yeah,
so I hope that
the
answers
law
your
is,
question.
I think the law you were talking about is GDPR, but
GDPR. Oh my God, I can't believe I forgot that, but I just blanked out. But yeah, okay.
That's okay.
Hope I answered that question.
There's so many questions. I would go through all of them and as many, so you can keep them coming. I'm just going to add to the commentary on, how can design actually play a process in democratizing data? I think there's a usability element to data democratization, right? So there's a lot of talk these days about, hey, how do we essentially create an API layer on top of data and make it easily accessible? I think that is, fundamental from a design perspective. Not everybody wants to look at things, in necessarily just one way. How do we make data standards more interchangeable and accessible? And those are all sort of important things. I think from a purely design philosophy perspective, we live, I think, in an extraordinary time where people are actually weaponizing bots and weaponizing data and misinformation. I think the moral stature of a designer to better communicate through design principles the truth around data is now more important than ever before. So, I often say, if you're philosophically aligned to transparency and seeking the truth, you will be a great designer in the world of, eliminating data misinformation, right? So I think it's a really, I think, a moral imperative as a designer today to make that happen. The next question we've got is, nowadays all companies have internal data science teams.
Ken, I just want to add to that super quick. If you want to understand what's currently being done in the space, I encourage you to look into Cortex by Cognitive Scale. They have like kind of a visual GUI for building AI models. Check it out. Might help out. Sorry, go ahead, Ken.
What role, I screen flipped here. Nowadays, all companies have internal data science teams. How does EY differentiate itself in value add? This one's for you, Vish.
Okay, this is a tough question. Okay.
Technically, you're a part of this team.
Yeah.
So what is your differentiator? I'd like to know.
I have a great hairstyle and beard. So that's a great question. I think when it comes to what internal data science teams do, they focus very much on a specific set of problems that are inherent to the nature of the business they're operating in, right? Whereas an EY kind of looks at the company's health as a whole. What I mean by that is, if a data science team at company XYZ looks to build collaborative filtering models to make their recommendation systems better, EY uses machine learning to make their tax liability across multiple different countries a lot lower. That's what we do. I think that's an example of what we do, not necessarily what we're doing today, but I would imagine that's our value proposition. The other part of it is that an internal data science team doesn't have a viewpoint on what the industry as a whole is doing, right? And it's not to say that we're going out, revealing competitor secrets to our clients. Of course not. But we have any consulting company has a great understanding or an internal knowledge of what the industry is looking like when it comes to anything they do in consulting. And that's really the reason why consulting companies even exist in the first place, right? Why can't a company just solve its own problems? Well, because they're in the company. And being outside of the company gives you a certain level of distance that helps you solve the problem. Yeah. So I hope that answered that question.
Here's another great one. What are the top 3 reasons why a proof of concept of an AI product doesn't end up getting into production? I really like that one.
Oh, I love this. So all I did in my past life was proof of concepts. Well, because I'll tell you the first reason. It's killed a childbirth. That's the first reason. Because a business leader or someone who's funding the project wants just a proof of concept. It ends up being a very successful little demo, and it's built to be a little demo, and it never ends up scaling. A corollary to this is, why don't hackathons produce insanely amazing full-fledged product? Well, because they're created over 3 days in caffeine and Red Bull energy drinks. They're not built to scale. They're built because they wanted to build something super quickly for 3 days that looks cool in a presentation, right? So that's the first reason. The second reason I would say is, even if you discount the fact that it wasn't built, like let's give an example as a stakeholder wants a proof of concept to be built and then eventually scales into a full product. Even if you build a machine learning proof of concept with scale in mind, you're not operating at scale. Therefore, your model is not necessarily performing at scale. And as a result, when you start to try to scale it, you realize you're running into a ton of problems, and you realize the feature engineering is going to take a lot of time and a lot of resources to do. And the stakeholder goes, well, I thought it was just pushing it to the cloud and having it work, and they get disappointed. So that's one answer, I think. Let me think of a third reason. I think fundamentally, proof of concepts aren't necessarily built with the customer in mind. I really believe that. I think proof of concepts are boondoggles. They're built to sort of be flashy and fun, but they're not built trying to solve a very specific, tangible problem or move a very specific metric. And as a result, when you try to scale up the boondoggle, it just becomes this piece of thing that looks cool, but is basically a problem chasing a solution, or solution chasing a problem. So yeah, that's how I'd answer that.
I'll add a fourth one. I think, what happens when you actually do a POC and it's actually very successful as an algorithm and it still doesn't get into production. I've had the rather remarkable pleasure of seeing that happen, where, the results are seismic. And if we could just implement it, it would fundamentally transform an organization. And I think the answer to that didn't get into production very often is because of fear. It goes back to sort of the change management aspect of it is, what happens if you take what 50 people do right now, literally labeling, for example, social tweets and producing a report around that, and you replace that with a simple classifier algorithm. Suddenly those 50 people have to either be let go or they have to be retrained into a brand new job. And guess what? Now more than ever, the ability to build algorithms like that is available to everybody on this call. And the challenge and the reason those things don't get implemented is because we don't have a good change management philosophy or strategy on what happens when you create such seismic algorithmic recommendations, right? I think if you're a startup, it's easier. It's your job to disrupt the ecosystem, right? But if you're a services firm, how do you have that nuanced conversation with a large enterprise to say, hey, we have built an algorithm that can fundamentally change your business model or your operating model, right? And people don't necessarily like the change that algorithms recommend, right? And that fear factor, I think, is a big aspect of it. And so this then ties into the question from Tim, and so are there opportunities at a firm like EY for people in this crossover area? I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think we need a strategy meets data and a strategy meets AI kind of change manager or strategic consultant that understands the changes that are inevitable coming from data and manages expectations of the client from day one or day zero, knowing very well that this kind of change is very possible with our technology and with our algorithmic techniques today. So that's what I like to see. Here's a really interesting one. let's see here. Do you think, let's see here, do you foresee a time where ML models will be free, or like mobile apps that users pay as they go? What do you think, Vish?
It's a good question. I think I don't think so. I might be completely wrong on this, by the way. It's very hard to predict the future. But the reason why I don't think so is because ML models are so use case dependent. Regardless of how much you democratize, building and deploying a model is not a trivial thing. And I think this concept of models on demand, not necessarily. Features on demand, yes. There are many instances of companies building, sorry, about to sneeze, but the sneeze didn't come. Damn it, worst feeling ever. Many examples of companies building successful feature stores to share features across teams and make feature engineering a lot easier. So maybe yes, features, models, probably not. But hey, I don't know, man. That's a hard question.
So I'll answer that by saying, I think that you're seeing some interesting work happening in this space now. There are companies that are, touting themselves as algorithmic marketplaces. Algorithmia is a good example. And I think, anyone can now go and search for, a model that someone wrote on and has it, saved on GitHub that you can download and play with. And, there are issues with being able to do things like that. I think I think the journey has begun. I think if you look at prediction systems or data and AI products, I absolutely think that those can be productized, but that's more than just an algorithm. It's more the need to say that, what, I have to create a target data structure to which all my source data is going to, or I'm going to force our source target mapping confirmation process around. Then once I have that target data structure productized in itself, I can write an algorithm on top of that. And then on top of that, there's a curation or a model management team that manages that model set of predictions as a managed service. And I think that journey as what is a data product, I do think we're going to see become more commoditized. I mean, I would argue that the most successful example of that is Google, right? It's the greatest data algorithm on the planet. We can't. It's like electricity to us now. We can't exist without it. But it's a combination of human augmentation, curation, as well as intelligent crawlers, machines, algorithms, whatnot, right? And that is that going to become more manageable and cost-effective for a variety of different things? Recommender systems might be a place where that starts to happen. We may see, a marketplace of healthcare predictor systems for specific disease treatment models. There's a lot of VC activity around that. So it's a space that I'm very excited to see. I'm always a believer, and I guess I'm more the optimist on this call. I'm always a believer that we should open things, right? I mean, there's a great talk by Tim Berners-Lee on this topic. He says, his contributions to the net obviously are extraordinary, but he says that the next thing he's most passionate about these days is open data and how do we democratize data, right? So I think if it's good enough, if Tim Berners-Lee is as optimistic about it, I'm optimistic about it, and I think we all have to play a part to make that happen, particularly in the enterprise world.
Yeah, Ken is an optimist. I think I would say I'm an optimist, but I'm a skeptic. I'm skeptical about whether we'd be able to achieve that vision. Simply, and I think the main reason, I think Ken makes a lot of great points, but my main point of disagreement is around de-risking that kind of environment, right? Who's liable if a model fails? And even if a model does succeed, who's responsible for the maintenance, of that model that they bought on this marketplace? It's, I think like it can work in scientific environments, it can work in fun casual competition environments, but when it comes to enterprise level, I'm skeptical. But I'd love to see it happen. I'm skeptical.
Yeah. The next one we've got is, in your experience, what has been the biggest friction point for internal adoption of AI ML for EY? There was a brief mention of technical knowledge gap. You want to take this one, Vish, first?
This might be an incredibly political answer, so I'm going to try to skirt around the question as much as possible. I'm joking. I think it's not disbelief. That's the myth I'd like to dispel first. Everybody believes that machine learning and AI has value. At least at EY, the good majority and plurality of people are excited about machine learning and what it can mean. When it comes to adoption, I think it's confusion about how to get started. So when a partner comes to us with a problem, they do believe that AI and ML can help them solve it, and they do believe that talking to us is the right first step. But the issue becomes, well, what does that collaborative framework look like between your team and my team? And is it just going to add more hours and more work and therefore be more expensive? That's the issue. I think the biggest friction point is understanding the trade-off between value delivered by AI and ML models versus the sort of initial investment that needs to be made. And generally speaking, in almost every single case, I think there's like a hump where you have to have a decent amount of investment made for you to be able to see recurring actual value. That's my answer to the question.
I mean, I'll add. I do think. Look, I mean, I don't think this is. We kind of live in a bubble here in Silicon Valley, right? We have the greatest talent in the world, I think, here clustered in the Valley. Unfortunately, clustered in our homes these days. But I think the reality is that if you go outside the valley, data science skills are not easily accessible, right? And so, for that to happen, there's almost a generational gap to implementing data on the field, right? And then again, organizations like Magnimind are really important, I think, to be able to train the next generation of practitioners that are going to join places like our firm or any large corporation that can actually persuade our clients to make the leap around using algorithmic technologies and techniques to change, right? I mean, it's hard enough to just convince someone to change as a human being. Imagine using algorithms and data to do so in a world that is, so apprehensive of bots these days and algorithms these days. So again, I think, there's a cultural and generational aspect to it. Same reason why I think, the younger generation is much more comfortable with what a timeline feed recommends to you than, someone who's more used to, reading the newspaper proactively or reading or watching something on TV, right? There's an element to adoption here that's, that's so multidimensional, right? So I think it's up to us to make the case in our jobs, in our lives, in our clients, in our community every day, and to continue to do so, whether our firm, other firms, clients, together, right? So I think that's the journey we're going to take together.
Great question from Alan here. I'll read it out. I feel that the successful deployment of AI across different contexts depends greatly on, and it's thus limited by, the power of underlying machine learning techniques. For example, it seems that NLU, machine learning comprehension, is still in its infancy. How do you deal with such limitations in your teamwork? Great question. I think it's also it's a better question for our AI labs because they focus a lot on the research, but I can answer to some degree. First things first, I think a lot of the ML use cases across EY aren't necessarily super complex. We're not trying to push the envelope when it comes to the actual ML techniques themselves. I think the greatest success we will have as an organization is in implementing simple models that solve simple problems with high impact. That's our first sort of area of discovery. When it comes to things like NLU or just machine learning models in general, there's a lot of great techniques being published every week. I mean, bird embeddings being an example, right? Like they're incredible. Like every month we hear of a new technique that is X% better than the previous technique, or there's a huge amount of hype around GANs that I think are super cool. But do we use it at EY? Sometimes yes, depending on the use cases, but more often than not, I think the biggest impact we have is with actually the simplest models. So yeah.
Right, let's keep going. Can you talk about what AutoML really means? How real is AutoML?
Okay, so I don't have a lot of experience necessarily with AutoML, but I think I can talk at a simple level what AutoML is. So I'm assuming everybody understands what feature engineering is and what automated feature engineering would look like. Taking once you kind of have like an understanding of what your features look like, AutoML is basically a process by which a model can take the features and start building them all iteratively, testing, cross-validating, and making the model better and better until it just sort of gets to the point where it's a perfect model. That's my understanding. That's my layman's understanding of AutoML. I haven't really used it, but I know that DataRobot, H2O.ai, they all have their own AutoML offerings. I think Google has one as well. I think it's real. As to whether it's the potential impact for AutoML, I think you'd have to ask like a research practitioner on whether it's actually way more effective than just doing things manually. My instinct is that probably there's a lot of investment in it, so probably is real. Yeah. Hope I didn't cop out of that answer, but that's as much as I know.
How to balance the time between building the model and model accuracy?
Depends on what you're aiming towards. Are you looking to build a model to satisfy a business outcome that is like super important, or are you looking to just minimize the risk of getting your answer wrong, and then you optimize for that? And when it comes to EY, I think we'd value accuracy over time. And feature engineering is, as I think belabored the point, is really hard and it's annoying. And there's a lot of methods to try to make it easier, but at the end of the day, at least for our teams, my understanding is that our allegiance is to accuracy and quality. We have our own little quality function built into our whole ML building framework to ensure that. So at least for us, we care less about time and more about the accuracy and power of our models.
I want to point out, and maybe this also sort of connects to the NLU question. A big part of this is also sort of expectations management with the client against a baseline. If the manual process or the baseline process with humans, or the legacy processes of the client are creating an error rate, say for parts maintenance at 60-80%, and you create an algorithm that's 80%. I mean, you've done an extraordinary job, right? So there's a bit of relativity associated with your specific domain and client scenario. And so it's important to sort of manage expectations, at the beginning right there. And then, also want to sort of like tie this to the earlier question around the fact that, technologies such as natural language understanding, et cetera, are I would argue still, in early days in the grand scheme of things. So what is EY bringing to the table in that space? I would say it's probably domain expertise, right? At some point, you've maximized what the algorithm can do, and what helps you do more is actually the fact that you've trained it well and you've actually contextualized it to your domain. And so, our value add and differentiation in our data science teams, I think, is applications of data science techniques to solving problems in very specific contexts and scenarios for the client. And I think, what we're known for at EY is really our domain expertise, right? So we want to marry that to the world of data science and data engineering and make interesting and cool products around that, right? I think if you do that, that ends up often being much more valuable than an out-of-the-box algorithm that is not domain contextualized, right? So even a not great and accurate algorithm, however, if it moves the client forward, considering their current state or their legacy state, is sometimes better than nothing, right? But then you've got to sort of manage the expectations with the client around that. So I'm going to switch now, since we've run out of open questions, to some of the answered questions that came in from the beginning. For the folks that are, we still have 45 participants. I don't know what you guys are doing here still, but since we still have 45 participants, I'll start going through. You can always, by the way, ask more questions, but the folks that are still here, we'll start going through some of the ones that came in since the beginning of the call that we may not have gone through. I did want to go through, I thought this was like a really philosophical question, but like, what does, why do this? Why is this sort of like, why do we want to democratize data, right? I think that's a really philosophical question. And I typed something, but like, Vishnu, why do any of this? Why do we want to democratize data? What's your perspective on this?
Well, I'd answer by saying, why not? Let's see what happens, right? I think that's a very chaotic answer, but Concretely, I think the reason is because we'd want to free up technical professionals, data scientists, ML engineers, to focus on really like high impact problems that are that require people with an incredible amount of technical skill. Data scientists and ML engineers, it's no secret that they're very hard to find, even harder to recruit, and even harder to retain. I think if we expose the basic tools of model building to a larger audience of people with a larger diversity of technical skills, you'll still be able to derive value on very simple things like building a recommendation engine. It should be very straightforward. And I think doing that at a non-technical level would add an immense amount of value to the enterprise. So that's my answer.
And I'll just sort of reiterate what I typed in, but my perspective is, imagine a world, imagine the modern day like coding ecosystem, developer ecosystem without GitHub, without Stack Overflow. I mean, it's unimaginable today, right? But like, believe it or not, back in my days, when we still had to look at basic technical manuals and learn the syntax, memorize the syntax, and type stuff in, right? So think of the transformation and the acceleration of code sharing that we've had in just the last, I would say, 10 years. It's extraordinary. And I think that we need a similar revolution in data and in AI, right? So I think that is still pending as a revolution, and we haven't quite figured out what that means. So I think it's important, and I think it's the humanity benefits, coders benefit, data scientists benefits from open ecosystems around data and AI. So I think that's sort of my perspective. I really like this question around what does democratization of data sort of mean, and are we talking about giving data to everybody? And I think Vish obviously gave a great presentation around this, but I'll talk in very like specific ways about the fact that when I talk to a client about, if I were to go talk to a client like tomorrow, and this happens often, is where the client will say, Ken, how do we do data democratization? There was literally a question about this at a meeting that both of us were in not too long ago. And I often say, there's the talent equation. And very specifically what that means is sometimes it's as good as creating a SWAT team that knows SQL better than anybody else. And you unleash those SQL guys to go and connect the dots across the different SQL silos or marts that are out there. Then there's the systems way of thinking around it, right? So, if you grew up in the 80s and 90s around technology, we've spent, millions of dollars on data warehousing projects, which was meant to democratize data, 2-3 decades ago, right? Never happened, right? And, if you're an academic, there are still two schools of thought there. There's the Inman school of building a data warehouse, and there's sort of the Kimball school of building a data warehouse. One is app first, the other is operational system warehouse first. And then in the past, I would say 10 years, we became obsessed with Hadoop and data lakes, and that was supposed to democratize everything. Never really happened. Just a new wave of multi-million-dollar initiatives that went nowhere. And today everyone's talking about modern data platforms and AI ML platforms. Is that really going to happen and change the world? Again, I think to some degrees, yes, because change is inevitable. But I don't think it's going to happen unless you do the work around culture and change management and create a firm culture where data democratization is embraced and welcomed, and hoarding is a bad thing. And I'm a big believer that we have incentives in large Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies that still lean towards data hoarding, right? Knowledge is power, data is power. And so, companies, even within themselves, countries, business units don't always want to share things, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why consulting companies are so successful, is because we act as almost like this connective tissue connecting the different business units together. So we're using, humans to solve the democratization of information and data within a large corporation, right? But we've got to come up with, I think, more technological solutions to make that happen as well. And then I think the creation of data products and consumerizing a data API layer, these are all mechanisms that I think will make our lives easier, right? I mean, most people today, when they join a company, say, is there a wiki at this company I can look at? Is there a knowledge base? I could look at, that was not so easy, not too long ago, right? So we've got to keep, as practitioners, when we go join our clients or work at these companies, push the envelope and be a force of democratization for data at these companies. Next one, how do we remove bias from AI, Vish?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's probably one of the most popular blog articles on Medium, or honestly any platform, is people opining on how to remove bias. And I think all of them start with the sort of same trend, which is to look at the data. And I think the constant thesis I'm seeing from these articles and opinions, and even facts, I'd say to some degree, is that the bias starts with the human. It is the human that collects the data first and therefore bakes the bias in. Identifying that, I think, is the first step. I think a great example that I read, I don't recall if it was a blog article or a book, was about predicting, like, let's say in a hypothetical scenario, a bank decides to predict whether a certain individual is worthy of mortgages. And they look at past features. Okay, let's say we get data from 80 years of mortgage approvals to build this model. And on first brush, the novice would think, this is great, we have so much data. We can now build a model that clusters people on whether they are approved for mortgage or not, right? A thing like, it's just a thought experiment, by the way. What this fails to account for is the fact that there's been a history of racism and redlining in how mortgages are actually given out. I would say not just in America, but probably other countries as well. And the inherent data, like even if you just imagine two tables, yes or no, that in and of itself is a biased data set, because the kind of human decisions that were made 40 to 50 years ago, maybe even still today, were inequitable, right? They were terrible, and they had a ton of bias in them. And even if you think about it at a very basic level, such a machine learning model would not work that well. So I think that's the first step, is to look at the data and to really approach it not from a data science perspective or from an engineering perspective, but from like a philosophical perspective. And I think that's why I think rooting yourself in human psychology and philosophy, I think, is super important when it comes to like being able to critically dissect how data actually is created in the first place. So sort of that's my answer. I think there's a ton of great material out there on how other people think about it, but I'm a bit of a reductivist. I'm a bit of I like to simplify things, and that's where I would start. Yeah,
that's great. I do think that the problem is big enough that being able to tackle it, or literally showing an initiative to tackle it in itself, becomes a differentiator in someone's AI ML portfolio. And I think you're also seeing some really interesting companies pop up, startups pop up, that help you better track or manage or report the bias in a particular scenario or situation. I have a good friend of mine who actually has a company in Europe, and her product is all about actually just seeing to see if we can track and measure bias in very specific scenarios. And there's interesting research happening in this space as well. I mean, there's a great paper from IBM Research around a technique called MASIM, or model agnostic contrastive explanation methods, that has actually been now productized in their portfolio called IBM OpenScale. And it's all basically about showing scenarios around the model and increasing transparency, and using that to basically give a score on how biased do we think this is. So I'm hoping this field is going to sort of like continue to grow, and we're going to see more and more interesting mechanisms and methods around this. But I think it's a fundamental issue in our time, right? There's a great New York Times article about how there are judges now literally in our legal system that use algorithms to quickly make life impacting decisions using algorithms, right? As these become biased, I think the answer is we need mechanisms and systems that track and show that bias. And if we don't, we're creating a world of new challenges for us that are further compounded by technology. Here's one that I really like. Does everyone have a part in this data together to do anything useful? I think the answer is yes. I think a big part of democratization might be, the creation of learning systems or feedback loops, or democratizing what I call annotation or training, right? I mean, a good analogy might be, the Mechanical Turks and what they did for, image recognition, right? And that was such a breakthrough moment that came out from that. But like I keep saying to us to say, are we going to have an ImageNet moment in the private space and in services business, et cetera? But I think the idea of creating tools that democratize annotation, training, feedback loops, et cetera, is an extraordinary opportunity for all of us to sort of participate in data democratization, right? And you don't have to be a data scientist to do that. That's literally you just participating in the data curation process. So I think we all play a part, whether we're data scientists or not. Vish, you want to add anything to that?
I think you covered perfectly.
Okay, let's keep going. This was, I thought, a very EY specific question. What's your opinion around using one of the three big cloud providers, AWS, GCP, Azure, for cloud-based AI? What are the challenges? What do you recommend to your clients, et cetera? So, full disclosure, EY has a huge partnership, obviously, with Azure. That said and done, we are taking a multi-cloud approach to building all our products for our clients, and we're also looking quite aggressively in the open source ecosystem to build our own, proprietary algorithms. I think from an infrastructure perspective, we obviously have a huge partnership with Microsoft, which has a great partnership, obviously, with OpenAI, et cetera. But we're not like married to one cloud from a algorithmic perspective as much as us building our own IP and algorithms in-house to solve mission critical client problems, and that can be also using open source libraries. You want to add something to that, Vish?
No, I don't really have any opinions on cloud stuff as an ML engineer. I'll take what I can get. So yeah, I mean, I think the landscape's rapidly evolving. I think classically I've used AWS. It's been interesting to work with Azure, and hopefully one day I'd like to get to work on GCP as well. But I think at this point, I wouldn't necessarily say the market's commoditizing or commoditized, but everyone's building exactly as the customers request them. So the differences to me are more in who do you want to partner with, who shares your vision long term, and what is sort of your operating model with your cloud provider. So that's how I see it.
Great. So we're almost coming in, I guess, to the 2-hour mark, I guess, in 20 minutes or so, and we've started to. We're now down to 37 participants, and I think we've done the bulk of the questions. I'll end maybe with what might be the most important question, but this all sounds cool. How do I get involved? What's the journey, right? And why don't you go with that one first, Vish?
How do you get involved? So let's define that question. How do you get involved as a data scientist? How do you get involved with EY? Let me answer the data scientist part.
Let's answer all of them.
So I think, I wouldn't count myself as a computer scientist or a computer engineer. I don't have formal training in computer science aside from a couple of courses I took. I fell into machine learning and AI by applications. Like I needed to solve a problem, and building a deep learning model helped me solve the problem. So I learned how to do it. And I started with scikit-learn. It's very simple stuff. I think the important thing is to figure out a problem that you want to solve that whose easiest solution is building an ML model and training an ML model, and go solve it, or get involved in a community like Kaggle, right? I think a lot of you data scientists already know what I'm talking about. It's the best way to practice. It's the best way to get involved. How to get involved with EY? Interesting point. I think it's a question that maybe Ken can answer better, but our AI team has grown significantly. When I first joined, it was just me and 2 other folks, and we've grown it over the past year from, I'd say, 0 to 110 FTEs across 6 countries, all ML engineering, data scientists folks. I think we have some plans in FY21. I think that they're probably going to be discussed at some point in the future. But reach out to me, reach out to Ken. We can maybe answer that question depending on exactly the nature of involvement you'd like to have. But I think I think everyone in this industry is looking to hire great talent. So if you believe you're a great ML engineer, there's always going to be a place for you. Whether it's at EY or any other company, you're going to be in demand. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll add to that by saying, I think, being able to do some project-based learning, like Vish was talking about, is obviously going to give you a step ahead. And I'm actually a big believer that sure, a formal academic education of course helps, but I don't think it's that vital. I think what's more actually vital is domain expertise and curiosity around a particular business domain to solve a problem. And then you can always be paired by a really heavy statistician in an organization like EY. But I think the best management consultants that I see that are also playing the part of data scientists these days are actually self-taught. And the availability of boot camps like Magnimind absolutely help us do that. So if you feel like you're too undisciplined and can't quite get yourself to go through all the projects by yourselves, go to a boot camp like Magnimind and just I don't think that I think that's as comparable as anything you're going to go do. In fact, I've met people who go for formal PhDs from statistical programs, but they don't know the latest libraries or the latest technologies to apply in a domain-specific sort of way, right? So I think this is an extraordinary time where education, particularly data science education, has become so democratic. When I was working at a startup, it was much more important to look at the Kaggle score of an incoming hire than whether he had a PhD from a major statistical university, right? So, get involved, I think, in the virtual community for data scientists via programs like Kaggle, et cetera, get a GitHub, and build a portfolio. Even if you're going through a formal boot camp like Magnimind, build your own portfolio and learn to tell a story using that portfolio in the industry or domain you want to go into. So it's not just about, gee, I know how to do algorithms. You want to be able to have someone who has a point of view to say, I know how to do this for marketing. I know how to do this for sales. I know how to do this for manufacturing. I know how to do this for tax analysis, or I believe that the work I'm doing, even if it's using public data and NLP, is relevant to tax because of XYZ. If you can tell that story, you will be in demand, right? Write a blog, just start contributing online, and there's an inevitably you will be found. It's such an extraordinary time to be in this space. So long story short, do project-based learning, participate in boot camps like Magnimind, and have a point of view and a story to tell that's relevant in the industry or domain that you are most passionate about. And folks will find you, right? And it's one of the reasons why Vish and I are doing, by the way, this call is always to keep an open door towards talent. And we welcome you guys reaching out to us. So that's all I had. I'd like to hand this back over to Magnimind to close this out. And thank you for inviting us today.
Thank you very much, Magnimind.
Yeah, thank you for your time and all your wonderful information you gave us during the show. The reason we try to give these talks is really just to bring people into our process and keep people furthering their learning and trying to get closer and closer to the industry and data science. And anyone who showed up, you're doing it today, so give yourself a pat on the back. Also, if you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and comment what you thought about this meetup or what you think about our Zoom format. Next week, tomorrow, Thursday, May 21st, we'll be having a talk on what developers know about the skills for Amazon Alexa with Noel Silver. So come out for that tomorrow. And thank you, and have a good night. Thank you, and Vishnu again. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Goodbye.
Thank you all.